The reason I'm interested in this, frankly, is because I think that they are symbols of a period in which, let's be blunt, in that same generational change, we've gone from having about 66 billionaires in this country to having more than 800. But the median hourly wage in this country has only gone up 20%. Mm-hmm. And to be very precise about it, there is now more money in the hands of the very rich in this country than there was at the height of the Gilded Age, when the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers and the Carnegies were dominating the cultural horizon. So we are living in a period in which those fortunes, and ultimately these kinds of, I think of them as these expressions of those fortunes in steel and suede and brass. That's why I wanted to write about it as materially as possible.
Thank you so much, Evan. It's so good to be here with you.
Thank you, Emily.
I have an official introduction that we need to read first. Hello, and welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. I'm Emily Chang, your host and executive producer. I work at Bloomberg Television. I'll be speaking with Evan Osnos tonight, author of the new book, The Haves and Have-Yachts, Dispatches on the Ultra-Rich. It's been mentioned multiple times in mainstream media that this may be one of the best book titles of all time, so I will not say it again. Evan is a staff writer at The New Yorker and has been since 2008, which is actually the same year we met in Beijing. True. His last book, Wildland, The Making of America's Fury, was a New York Times bestseller. He's also the author of Age of Ambition, my personal favorite, Chasing Fortune, Truth, and Faith in the New China, which won the National Book Award, and previously was a foreign correspondent for the Chicago Tribune. So, welcome.
That's a nice way of saying I've gotten awfully old. I don't know how that happened, but there we are. And it is a treat to be here with you, and all of you. Thank you for coming out. Grateful.
So we go back to our Beijing reporting days. You were at the Chicago Tribune. I was working for CNN. We were moderately paid, didn't have kids, so more than enough money to, splurge on dim sum.
Neither a have-yacht nor a have. Now that I think about it,
actually. Neither, and still maybe neither. But we're gonna find out. The haves at that time were bouncing back from the financial crisis. They were buying things more like private jets, art, dabbling in startups, maybe putting their name on a hospital. When did buying super yachts become a thing?
Yeah, they sort of have become this symbol of our time, and it was not always that way. I mean, I'm reminded sometimes that the Victorians had an expression about yachts, which is that your yacht, or your boat, really, should only be as long in feet as your age. And which I think is, somebody should mention that to certain tycoons who have boats that are 439 feet long. A generation ago, there were not that many super yachts or giga yachts, to use perhaps my favorite term.
Not giga yachts.
No, that would be a terrible faux pas if you were on a giga yacht called "This is a beautiful giga yacht." There were only 10 of them a generation ago, and today there are 170 of them.
Wow!
And by the way, they've gotten much, much bigger, and as they've gotten bigger, the smaller ones have become known in the industry as pocket yachts. I find there's nothing worse than somebody spending $100 million and then having to be told, this is a nice little pocket yacht you've got there. Look, the reason I'm interested in this, frankly, is because I think that they are symbols of a period in which, let's be blunt, in that same generational change, we've gone from having about 66 billionaires in this country to having more than 800. But the median hourly wage in this country has only gone up 20%. And to be very precise about it, there is now more money in the hands of the very rich in this country than there was at the height of the Gilded Age, when the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers and the Carnegies were dominating the cultural horizon. So we are living in a period in which those fortunes, and ultimately these kinds of, I think of them as these expressions of those fortunes in steel and suede and brass. That's why I wanted to write about it as materially as possible.
Now, going back to the Gilded Age, I mean, there were, 20 millionaires and then suddenly 4,000 by the end of the century. Hasn't wealth been sort of exploding and more people getting wealthy over generations? Like, what's different about now?
Scale and speed. It's amazing to realize it because it's sort of an ambient fact of our time that I don't think we focus on the fact that 10 years ago, there was nobody in the world who had $100 billion. Elon Musk, by the way, there are now 15 people who meet that description. Elon Musk, 10 years ago, had $10 billion. He now has $400 billion.
It's not just inflation, right?
It's not. I wish that we were all enjoying such a rate of return. Look, there is a point at which Warren Buffett would tell you that there's an almost arithmetic momentum that takes hold. And I think we're now preparing for the age. It will be on us in probably the calculations are between 10 and 15 years, we'll be in the age of trillionaires. I spoke to archaeologists for this project to try to put this in some perspective. And an archaeologist named Tim Carrick, who studied income inequality back to the Neolithic period, he said the people who built the pyramids were living in a less unequal society. If you really think about that, that's an astonishing fact. And I think we know it in the abstract and we don't quite name it. And that's why I wanted to make it as clear as I could.
Now, I remember actually when you were writing the super yacht story, and suddenly it seemed like everyone seemed to have them, Mark Zuckerberg, et cetera. Now that you've unmasked these yacht owners, what's the new trendy thing to buy? I mean, is it still yachts, or is there something better out there?
I have to say, I spent some time looking at doomsday refuges, too. I went to New Zealand to go look at some of these hideaways. This is not a hardship assignment, by the way. But you've hit on something important, which is that there is a hedonic treadmill, this idea that nothing will ultimately satisfy. And I think that, in the end, is kind of the core of what these essays are about. It's trying to describe something that is ultimately without end. Because ultimately, when somebody gets to, I have some experiences and some cases of people who would build the most beautiful yacht in the world, and then all of a sudden somebody would come along and build something bigger, and people would all of a sudden look. It's measured in what's literally known as length overall, LOA, and I think I came to see that as this kind of strange mutant form of measuring success. Is your length overall. And now it doesn't take an elaborate imagination to say what we're really kind of getting at here. But there is a way in which this has become this expression of an ultimately unresolvable sense of ambition and void. Like, what is it that we're building for at a certain point?
You reminded me earlier that my colleague Brad Stone, editor of Bloomberg Businessweek, I'm not sure if he's here yet, but broke the story about Jeff Bezos's super yacht. And it's not only that they have them, but they some of these folks seem more comfortable displaying their own wealth. Like, for example, Mark Zuckerberg posting the statue of his wife in his backyard and photos of their new matching Porsches. What do you think is driving the greater comfort of showiness here?
Yeah, there's something really interesting going on because historically, wealth was, by design, quite strategically out of view. I mean, there's an old expression in the private wealth management world, which is that the whale that never surfaces doesn't get harpooned. And that was a kind of a useful principle for about 500 or 600 years. And we got into the age of social media, and it's not just social media, it actually has to do with who we valorize in society, but there's been a celebrification of wealth. And it's quite recent, actually. I mean, I think, so the yachts are a good example of this, because they exist in this strange kind of conditional state of visibility, in my mind, meaning that they're not supposed to be visible all the time, but they're supposed to show up occasionally on page 6 or in the right kind of social media formulation. I mean, I'll be explicit about it. I mean, I had a CEO in Silicon Valley say to me that his yacht is, as he put it, the best way to absorb excess capital, which I thought was like in a sentence that should be written on stone a way of capturing a moment in time. He said because a $500 million house is kind of weird. He said the optics are wrong, your employees will be very unhappy. He said, but this is what he said. He said a $500 million boat is actually quite nice. And I think there is a weird way in which this has become, as another yacht owner said to me, it's the last place that you can get away with it. I think there is an element of this, which is that these are these objects that straddle the difference between a level of wealth that, frankly, most Americans have lost the ability to conceptualize. Warren Buffett says, I have an incomprehensible sum of money. And he's right about that. I think for most Americans, it's hard to understand what these numbers mean, and these machines become the expression of them. But as a result, they live on the knife's edge between being a source of tremendous discontent and of aspiration. And I think that captures something very American, which is, do Americans ultimately want to eat the rich or join them at the table, right? That's the puzzle.
It's a very complex American dynamic. And is it a uniquely American dynamic that we love and hate these people?
I think the Chinese, you and I both lived in China. I think China is the other place that has a very complex relationship that is this combination of both and oscillates back and forth. But the American experience, this is not, I'm not making a general point. There was a poll last year, for instance, where 59% of Americans say that billionaires are making the country less fair. And an identical share of Americans want to become a billionaire themselves. And in many cases, in fact, it was the same respondent who had both ideas. I think there is a way in which this is our natural condition, is to be suspicious on the one hand. Thomas Jefferson talked about the idea that the United States should be an aristocracy of talent. We would not have inherited dynastic wealth. That was to be our distinctive separating thing from the Europeans. On the other hand, there's nothing more American than saying I want to prosper and I want my kids to prosper and everything else. And so we end up, once we created the tools, this is the key thing, we created the tools, financialization and other ways, of generating these returns beyond which they had ever really existed. And as a result, we've now entered this stratosphere level of wealth. And it's beginning to put stresses on America's what has been a tolerance for inequality by comparative standards to other countries. The data shows actually people are getting unhappy. They're getting unhappy. And this is honestly the point of this project, is to say, to mark a moment in time when that's happened.
Well, and let's go there, because other than the obvious voyeuristic entertainment of this book, and you enjoyed some fresh squeezed orange juice on a yacht yourself?
I did subject myself to some rigorous field
But why is it important that we know how billionaires spend their money? Why should we care?
I think that there is a way that the choices and the values of a small group of individuals are reverberating through our lives all the time, on a basis that we might not even fully recognize. If you're talking about, to take social media as an example, the decisions that the leader of an institution, let's just say Elon Musk, the choices he makes about what goes on his platform then has an impact on our politics, on our political culture, on questions of anti-Semitism, on questions of hate speech. All of these are, ultimately, they do begin with what he thinks about those. And you could say, okay, 100 years ago you had William Randolph Hearst, and you had the great newspaper barons, and they were involved in their own kind of battles. But they didn't have a technology that was optimized for the purposes of not just amplifying an idea and getting it out into everybody's house and mind, but then also optimizing the use of their attention and figuring out what they were interested in and their psychological vulnerabilities, and then maximizing that. You then can apply that to politics and consider the following fact. It's kind of an amazing number to really consider. In 2004, that presidential election, billionaires contributed $13 million, with an M, to the presidential election. In last year's election, 20 years later, billionaires contributed 200 times as much, $3 billion. So in the span of 20 years, and obviously, as you can imagine, this was facilitated by the Citizens United decision, the sheer acceleration of impact in politics that the very rich have had is you cannot understand how our politics works without putting that at the center of the conversation. So in a way, the case for paying attention to billionaires is that we are now at a time when the political, technological, and even psychological instruments of influence are so sharp and are so effective that they are shaping our lives in ways that we don't even fully comprehend every day.
Well, speaking of perfect timing, a huge breakup in the oligarchy has happened just in time for your
Right.
book tour. There are just bombs exploding in every direction.
I really do owe thanks to Mr. Musk and Mr. Trump for their work in promoting the significance of this book.
Is it over, or is this just the storming off dramatically phase?
I think there were moments there when it seemed like it might be a final break. Look, I have to say there were a couple things about it that struck me as really perfect material to capture in a time capsule of now. Mm-hmm. The fact that this entire war was playing out on separate social media networks that each of them owned. I should say nothing more. We should sit in silence for the rest of the hour, just while we think about that. So these are two individuals capable of broadcasting that effectively. The other thing that was kind of amazing was the comment that Musk made, and this is a reflection of his own kind of idiosyncratic way of thinking and talking, but he said, in effect, I bought this presidency and it's a defective product. I mean, he really was saying, were it not for me, you wouldn't be president and Republicans wouldn't have control of the Congress. That was like an entire career's worth of investigative reporting on campaign finance, and he just tweeted it right out.
Well, right. Do we still live in a democracy? I mean,
Debatable.
to that point.
Debatable. I mean, I think, look, what's fascinating when you begin to look at oligarchy as an idea is that it has never actually been a binary switch between democracy and oligarchy. I mean, from the beginning of this country, let's be honest, this was a country in which political power was reserved for white men who owned property. That's who could vote. So we've had some element of oligarchy from the beginning, but we had a different kind than we had now. I mean, the scholars call the one that we've had for 250 years a civil oligarchy, meaning that the oligarchs essentially believe that the rule of law benefits them. Ultimately, they should honor it because it's bad for business to blow it up. It's a little less clear right now. We're moving into a direction that's known, I love this term, as a sultanistic oligarchy, in which the oligarchs essentially agree to have one among them be the leader. Putin is the classic sultanistic oligarch. And that's what happens when the person begins to prevail over the law. And when you have one individual, and it's impossible not to imagine them in, sultanistic garb, but when you have one person who essentially defines what the law is, you've entered new territory. And we've seen what that looks like. It's rarely very good for the economy. It's rarely very good for democracy or anything like civil liberties. It's a ruinous path. And part of the reason for kind of calling it out by its proper name is to point out that this is not this is a threshold that you can pass, and it takes work to preventing from going down that path.
So it's getting very confusing now here in Silicon Valley, given that many of these folks also supported Trump only after Elon Musk came out and said he was endorsing him. You talk about the inauguration and obviously all the tech scions sitting there front and center. Sergey Brin, who once called Trump's rise to power deeply offensive. Apple CEO Tim Cook, who called the Capitol riots shameful, and yet they showed up. Is this a change in values, or is this just business?
I think, there's an old idea that makes a lot of sense to me, which is that money can change you, but first it will reveal you. And I think there are a lot of ways that people can rationalize decisions to themselves. You can say, I'm doing this for the sake of the shareholders. I'm doing this for the sake of the employees. I'm not saying that that's not a meaningful argument. But there's a whole range of reasons why people were on that stage. I would love, actually, at some point, somebody could write a whole book about that scene on the stage on January 20th, 2025. Because there were some people there who were motivated by an ideological kinship with Trump. I think Musk would fit that description, or some ideological / strategic calculation. Clearly, the kinship wasn't all that deep. But there were others there who were there out of fear. And I've come to think, which raises an interesting question, because you get to be at a certain height. You're the founder and CEO of your company. You have all the money you could ever conceivably need. You have all the control of your company. You can't really be very easily pushed out. So why are you standing there, subjecting yourself to what and a lot of these guys have pollsters, what your pollster will tell you is going to be a very polarizing choice. Mm-hmm. In fact, you're going to be much less appealing than Trump is, even, because it's going to read to people as a plainly self-interested kind of mercenary decision. And I think that there comes a point when you get so high up in the stratosphere that two things happen. One, you develop a kind of vertigo. I think you get aware of how exposed you are. You're exposed to either a public backlash, the prospect of that, or you're exposed to the possibility that an authoritarian president could seek vengeance on you. Mm-hmm. And so in the case of Mark Zuckerberg, Trump had literally said, "I'm going to put him in jail." Mm-hmm. So that doesn't take a huge amount of imagination at that point. But you have a choice about how one handles that. It's interesting to look at that portrait on the stage and actually to look at who wasn't there. Who were the CEOs of big companies who weren't there? Because a lot of people weren't, actually. Mm-hmm. And I think there was a way in which, this brings to the second thing that happens to you when you get into that stratosphere, is that you get surrounded by people who agree with you a lot. You get surrounded by people who, there may be one person who is sort of the designated, "I'm not so sure this is a great idea, boss" kind of person. But the truth is that person doesn't usually stick around all that long. You often end up surrounded by people who say, "I think you're making a wise, prudent decision." And you end up doing things that may not actually register with the public in the way you think they're going to.
Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella was not there, and I asked someone close to the company, I said, "How did you decide not to have him show up?" And this person simply said, "Carefully." Mm-hmm.
I know there was another CEO on that stage, a tall person, who slightly hunched during the standing parts because didn't want to be so visible. So there was a way in which there was like this calculation going on. But I look at it from the perspective of what the American public saw out of that. Mm-hmm. This is where I think we have to remind ourselves what we're talking about here. This is a ritual of democracy in which Americans are looking and saying, okay, these are the people this is the president who will serve in my name. And the members of Congress had been relegated to the audience because the stage was so full of billionaires. And what is the message that people take from that? People take from that we live in a country in which money rules and money is power.
I will never forget. I came into the room when the inauguration was on, and my 12-year-old who now knows these people because I cover them, was like, "Mom, Zuck and Sundar are in the front row. They're in front of the cabinet members." And even he, at his young age, understood that was crazy.
See, you know what's amazing about that is he's going to come of age right now at a time when this is a live question. Of, do we want to become that way, or do we not want to become that way? Is this an aberration? Will we will we decide as a public culture that this was like a strange offshoot of the Trump dynamic, or is this the new normal? Mm-hmm. And in a way, I think that what's happened is that Trump and Musk, in his particularly brazen way of being, has kind of forced us to a reckoning point on these questions, because we are at the point now where we are deciding, are our kids going to grow up in a country where that's the way it is? Mm-hmm. Or are we going to be a country that actually says, we veered away from that path? And I think we're right there at that moment right now.
I do wonder, there's this question of what does Silicon Valley do now? Who's the sultan? Is it Elon or is it Trump? Who do they, ultimately rally behind? If you look at Tesla shares are now plunging, and who has the losing hand here?
Yeah, in a way, I think Musk discovered that the reservoir of public will was shallower than he thought. I mean, I think the ferocity with which people turned against him was interesting. It was, his ejection from Washington, which is really what happened, was that in a way he kind of passed a threshold that was undescribed. It wasn't clear how much Americans would tolerate the world's richest man having control of a department of government and having an office in the White House complex, something that Carnegie and Rockefeller never did. This was new. And it felt quite Russian in its way. It just felt oligarchic. And there's a great scholar, Jeffrey Winters, who studies oligarchy. And about 10 or 15 years ago, when he started teaching it, in the beginning, American students, his first crop of American students at Northwestern said, we don't have oligarchs in this country. We have wealthy people. We have donors. Russia has oligarchs. And what he's found over the last 10 or 15 years is that the mood among young people has changed markedly. I think that's partly because of Citizens United, but it's now to the point where he has to persuade them that actually we do have a democracy that is worth fighting for and worth saving. And this gets back to this question about democracy and oligarchy have always existed in some proportion. And it's not about declaring that the system is irredeemable or that we're done, whatever. Like, it's about shifting that balance and saying, this is not what we signed up for. Mm-hmm. This is not fair. This is not sustainable. And probably this is not durable as a country.
I like adding the word bro to other words to create new words. And this is not a new word, but I do think we should mention that this is not an oligarchy we're talking about. It is a broligarchy that we are talking about.
Yeah.
What are the consequences of the fact that most of these super, 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 super rich people are men?
It's a massively important fact. I mean, I remember, and you've written about this more eloquently than anybody, but there was a great line in an oral history that somebody said, we're going to go back someday and we're going to look at what it meant for society that the internet was essentially, the architecture was created by young white guys in the Westchester County of New York. I mean, the fact, and ultimately out here, but the idea that it is an expression of values. And I think this is partly why I find why it's important to pay attention to the individuals themselves. It might make some people a little bit uncomfortable, but part of the, that's kind of goes with the ball game. Like, if you want to be considered a great leader, if you want to stand on that stage next to the President of the United States and be regarded as somebody of public attention, then we deserve, as a public, to pay attention and to know the details. And I think that's where it becomes important to understand, how do these folks think about things like the trade-off between growth and harm? How do they think about the meaning of truth? How do they think about the origins of violence in our society? How do they think about who deserves protection and who doesn't? Because they're sort of political questions in the sense that they're matters of the commons. These are questions about how we shall live together, but they're not adjudicated through politics. They're adjudicated through our technologies. And at times, some of the companies have tried to say, we're going to create quasi-political institutions. We'll have these advisory groups that weigh in on these kinds of...
The overseer board.
Exactly. And it had the sort of the suggestion of jurisprudence about it, but it was voluntary, and it was ultimately, in some cases it worked and in some cases it didn't. But I think what we saw when Musk acquired Twitter was that in the end it only lasted as long as the principal wanted it to. And so that is we're living within their values.
How sustained is this explosion of wealth? Does everyone keep getting richer? Does the wealth gap keep getting bigger? Or, does AI level the playing field and we're all lying on the beach and eating bonbons and surviving off universal basic income?
Well, it is amazing that a century ago, John Maynard Keynes more or less said, I think if things go how I think they'll go, we'll all be sitting on the beach eating bonbons. He wasn't the bonbon kind of guy, so he didn't use that term. But there was an idea that we would essentially reach a point at which labor would become superfluous. We would be so advanced technologically and economically that we would be working 4 hours a week or whatever. This has been the eternal dream. I think we're now at this point where, for all the ways that we know, where AI is forcing this question upon us much faster than the public is even kind of aware of or prepared for. I'll answer the question actually with a useful number, which is that if the last 40 years is transposed onto the next 40 years, if we have the same trends, here's what happens. This is according to Bob Lord, who's a tax expert who spends all his time kind of doing these sorts of projections. Right now, the top 0.00001% of Americans, which is about 19 people, have 1.8% of the nation's wealth. Over the next 4 decades, if the same trends continue, they'll have 18% of the nation's wealth, which is a breathtaking fact. I mean, 10 years ago, it was 2 or 3 of the richest Americans had the equivalent of the bottom 50%. Right now, it's one person, Elon Musk. So that's when I talk about a fork in the road, I mean, that's kind of where we are. And we can decide that we're okay with that, or we can decide that that's not a sustainable path. I mean, Louis Brandeis, in 100 and some years ago, Supreme Court Justice, said, you can either have democracy or you can have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but you can't have both. And the reason you can't have both, in his mind, was that when you get to be a certain size, as an individual or as a company, this was partly an argument in his mind against monopoly, that what happens is you get what he described, it's a great term, he said that society gets the curse of bigness, because things get so big they become sovereign, in effect. Individuals can become sovereign. And we see this in other systems. I mean, Xi Jinping is very alert to the risk of oligarchy in a way. I mean, I think, I mean, he sort of looked at Russia and he's like, I never want to be Boris Yeltsin, where I'm beset by these oligarchs, and I will never allow that to happen. And he never wanted to have individuals who were sovereign. And so as a result, and Putin, of course, had another view, which was, I will, to use a Chinese expression, kill a chicken to scare the monkeys. He will make it very clear to the other oligarchs what happens if you begin to go after power.
Well, and I wonder, because you also write about Guo Wengui, and you know, if you see, and Jack Ma comes to mind in terms of having that power and then running counter to what the higher powers desire, do you see a warning there for billionaires in the U.S. and other countries?
I mean, our system, mercifully, does not operate quite like the Chinese. Where, you know, Jack Ma, for people who've forgotten what happened, he gave a speech in which he criticized financial regulators, and he got off stage. There were people waiting for him backstage, and he found himself escorted to a white panel van and was then more or less vanished for the next several months. And when he returned to public life, he had been relieved of some of his leadership responsibilities, and he now sits like a potted plant on these, these political meetings. And that was a very deliberate choice to send a message to other. I mean, that was an astonishingly brutal thing to do, to take the single greatest entrepreneur of China's economic rise and to say, this is what happens if you stand up. Now, look, this is the joy of a democracy, is that we have choices we can make about how we actually want to situate political power and economic power in relationship to each other. And we're not subject to the anxieties of a sultanistic oligarch, at least not in the long term. But at the moment, we're toying with that prospect.
Do you see class more than race now as sort of the central fault line in American politics? This has been raised. And if so, like, how does this cascade?
I think that it is, class has been right there beneath the surface of our politics ever since 2016. I mean, it is an eternal fact, because Americans do oscillate around these questions of money and what do we think about it. But I think that, you know, Democrats right now are struggling to figure out, how do you say to Americans, we want you to get rich because that's your right, but we also want to tell you about why that's not already happening. That's a hard case to make, because right now the argument that they're hearing from Democrats is not really a coherent case about wealth. There's not a Democratic argument about wealth. And so there is a real contest going on about what that will look like. I remember talking to a Democratic politician who may well be in this process, who is trying to figure out, well, what is the vocabulary for a liberal argument for wealth that also allows the party to say, but the Musk of it all is the problem. That, in a sense, you have to be able to talk about oligarchy without saying, and that's why we don't think everybody should be able to pursue their dreams. Because what's amazing is, 4 years ago, Elon Musk was this huge icon of inspiration for people. He really was. I mean, particularly young people and young men, exactly the kinds of people that the Democratic Party has lost. And in a way, Musk has sort of taken himself out of that realm of
He was Iron
politics.
Man, right?
He was, yeah. Now, I mean, part of that was, a lot of work on his part to try to fortify that image. But there is not yet a figure that the Democratic Party can rally around who can take that message.
You talk about these yachts as sort of floating mini states, and all this deal making is now being done. This like solar system of billionaires just talking to each other behind closed doors on bigger and bigger yachts. Do you see if the rich only get richer, they only become more disengaged and more detached from traditional shared norms? Yeah. And what are the consequences of that?
Yeah, there is a kind of real risk of seclusion. I mean, I'll just to give you a little texture on some of this, which I think is always kind of fun and fascinating. The social anxieties involved are profound. I mean, there was the owner of a very big yacht, who is a prominent person, said to a guest, he said to him, you and I have a lot in common. You have a driver, I have a driver. You have a chef, I have a chef. You fly private, I fly private. He said, so the only way that I can tell the world that I am in a different effing category than you is the boat. So there's a way in which it is a completely undisguised, distilled concentration of hierarchy, taken to its most literal and frankly kind of juvenile form. But I think the risk of this is that you end up deeply secluded. There's a pattern, actually, in leadership studies called authoritarian backlash, which is that this is what happens. It happens in business, it happens in politics, that when you get so lofty in your organization and so surrounded by people who are either economically compromised to not tell you the truth, or they're scared, that you end up making bad choices and you ignite public backlash. And you do things like accidentally invade Ukraine and think you're going to get to Kyiv in 48 hours. This is exactly what authoritarian backlash is. But on a smaller level, Elon Musk is just a walking demonstration of that. He thought that he was basking in public adoration, and instead what happened was it turned out people were deeply offended. I mean, this is the thing. Americans are pretty tolerant of economic inequality, but not of political inequality. They don't like the idea that there is one person who has a bonus vote of 1,000,000 to 1. And so when Musk kind of flamboyantly enacted that idea and just kind of lived it out, standing there in the cabinet meeting with his hat and just kind of lording over the cabinet members, on some level, I mean, you know how it works. If you can turn off the sound on TV and still come away with an impression of somebody or something, that's a visceral response. And I think people came away with a visceral response that just said, this doesn't look like how it's supposed to work.
You mentioned the word anxiety. How much do you think some of these folks are motivated by insecurity? Like, Sam Altman actually blatantly said on Bloomberg, actually, that he's Elon is deeply insecure.
I think it's a huge piece of it. It's a crazy moment in the world that we are, frankly, sort of captive to the tender and undisguised, unresolved insecurities of a few guys. I'm sorry, but that's just the reality of it. And I think it's a weird way to live. And we're kind of, look, it happens periodically. I think Henry VIII had his issues, but suddenly here we are, and we're watching it play out the reason why it matters is not because of the reasons why Page 6 cares about it. The reason why it matters is because the children are watching. Like our kids are, as you so perfectly described a moment ago, like our society is making choices about who we celebrate and who we valorize and who we think is worthy of our attention. And we have to figure out a way to say, look, these are people who have been, there are people who are categorical successes as innovators, entrepreneurs. They've created wealth for themselves and for others, and who are not also living out these strange ways. And I think, I think part of this is about, look, nobody is perfect and nobody is utterly imperfect. Mm-hmm. But I'd like to see a little more of our kind of public discussion in this country celebrate somebody who's dedicating their fortune to eliminating malaria and eliminating polio and HIV, and talking in very explicit terms about why it is that there was a generation of philanthropy around Bill Gates and Warren Buffett's time, Mike Bloomberg as well. And there is just, in sheer data terms, much less philanthropy that is happening from certain major figures in the next the generation that comes now. And the New York Times has reported that Elon Musk's foundation has given so little away in some years that it actually violated the law of what's required to give away. According to the Times, one of Elon Musk's philanthropic grants was to a school located in his own home, in which 5 of the 14 children were his own. That's not a world I want my kids to be watching and thinking, that looks great. That's somebody I should really look up to. And so, yeah, I kind of take this as like a matter of, who do we assign great value to?
Mm-hmm. As someone who's covered tech for a long time, I've always loved when you take on some of these tech, these extremely powerful people outside of the Silicon Valley bubble and see how you approach it. And, we as journalists, we spend a lot of time with these people off the record that, readers don't see, viewers don't see. And I often get asked, do you like them? Like, do you like Mark Zuckerberg? And I don't, it's probably it's a trick question, but I'm going to turn it on you. Since you also spend a lot of time with some of these people. Like, do you like them? Like, do you like Mark Zuckerberg?
I think about it the same way I think about politicians, which is I don't really bring a particularly emotional quality to it. I'm honestly trying to evaluate how do they think about power. That's usually the question. How do they process it? How do they think about other people? How much are they situating themselves in relation to... And I would say the same thing if I was having a conversation with, like last year, I'm doing a profile of Kamala Harris or of, like Joe Biden, and you're trying to think about how does this person practice power? Mm-hmm. And there are elements of it that you might find admirable, but there are also elements that you think, it's kind of crazy that this person dominates our lives. And I actually think that the politics tech analogy is a decent one, because they're the only two kinds of figures who have that much control over what happens in our private lives.
And yet access is important. It helps us as journalists. How do you stay impartial?
I think that part of it is that in a lot of cases I'm encountering somebody and trying to, I'm not writing, like I don't cover them as a beat. Mm-hmm. And that's both an advantage and a disadvantage. It's an advantage in the sense that it's not a long-term relationship. It's kind of, I want to understand that person at a moment in time, or maybe one element. So, in this book, for instance, I quote Steve Huffman, the CEO, founder of Reddit, talking about the fact that he got eye surgery so that he wouldn't need eyeglasses or contact lenses in the event of the apocalypse.
I definitely was wondering if I should get LASIK after I read that anecdote.
Well, he would argue that you're being delinquent by not. As he said, it was an on-the-record interview, and he's talking about, he said, I've got guns and ammo and motorcycles, and I think I'll be able to get out of town if things are, if things get hairy. And I just remember thinking after that interview that, that's a useful public interested piece of journalism to explain how somebody who's in a position of some authority, in the sense that there's a lot of people who get on Reddit every day and are reading and thinking about it. And how does he see the world? It's not a criticism of him. I'm actually just expressing what it is that he's, and then to begin to wonder, why is it that some of the most powerful people in our society are so interested in, or so concerned about the breakdown of society, that they're spending and thinking about how to protect themselves in the event of it? That's, I think of that actually as a little bit more like a form of political journalism.
So let's talk about prepping, because some of the more colorful anecdotes come from that part of the book, that chapter. I'd like to talk about some of the more extreme scenarios that some of these folks are anticipating, including what is it? Do you kill the pilot or keep the pilot who's going to take you to your doomsday bunker? Do you save their family and make sure they're taken care of, or not?
Yeah. There was a hedge fund manager who
questions,
told me
right?
this. Yeah, this was telling me about a conversation. It was at a dinner table in New York, and he was there, and he said, we started having this kind of doomsday conversation about what do you do in the event of a societal collapse. And then somebody started saying, well, yeah, what do you do about the pilot? Are you bringing the pilot's family? And it was like... And it became, and eventually they concluded, this isn't going to work. We're going to have to think of another plan B. And somebody suggested, hey, how about we give a huge amount to charity and beef up things like public health and education? And they were like, well, maybe. I have to say there's a dark comic quality about this. And I think in that case, one of the reasons why this phenomenon happens is that I think people who by nature are hugely imaginative. Like they have to be able to think of extreme scenarios because that's how they created new things. Their mind either goes to the utopian scenario or the dystopian scenario. And that's like a pattern we had it actually at the end of the Gilded Age too, where you had these competing novels that would be either utopian scenarios or very dystopian. There was a novel by Jack London called The Iron Heel, in which he imagined, if you can bear with this idea, what he called a fascist oligarchy in which 0.9% of society owned a huge portion of the wealth. That was his vision of the future. And so that's what happened. But it was also at the moment we were having this tremendous breakthrough in innovation where you had the telephone and the typewriter and the elevator coming into being and transforming our lives. So I think what we're living through now, and this kind of is the backdrop to our conversation, is that part of the reason why we're seeing these slightly lunatic expressions of creativity and of anxiety is because it is a moment of such tremendous change, technological change, and then the sociological and political implications of that. This is what happens when societies go through this. And what we know, and here's the good news, is that we've actually been through the process of surviving that before. I mean, it's amazing. When you look at the end of the 19th century, lifespans among the poor were dropping. You had massive wealth inequality. You had these huge fortunes in the hands of who we now call the robber barons. It looked as if democracy itself wouldn't be able to hold. People were eventually, after the turn of the century, they were looking across at the rise of Bolshevism and saying, oh my God, is the United States going to go down that path? And what it took ultimately was that some of the most powerful people in both politics and in business made a decision to steer the boat, the yacht, I suppose, in a new direction. You had Teddy Roosevelt, for instance, and eventually FDR, who became, to use the great expression, traitors to their class, who said we have to preserve this system by giving up some of what we have. And then you had people like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. Carnegie said, this country will never thrive if people can't read. There was massive illiteracy. And so he started putting libraries in all the small towns. John D. Rockefeller founded the University of Chicago and gave away half of his fortune. And so in a way, you had people who figured out that and the result, of course, was what's known as the Great Compression, where inequality actually dropped for much of the 20th century. And you had the most innovative, most prosperous period in American history. So these two facts can coexist. It's not as if I think it's a false choice to say, well, if we put the shackles on our greatest innovators, our greatest builders, then we're not going to be able to do great things and China's going to trounce us. That's not actually what history suggests. We're a much more dynamic society and much more resilient society than China. And I could expound on that as much as people want to. But I think that we have the capability to get through this period without the illusion that this is a choice about bottling up our greatest talent.
All right, so some extremely thoughtful questions here from the audience. I don't know that we're going to get to all of them, but we'll do our best. When you talked about the celebrification of wealth, how do you think this trend affects American economic decisions? Are people more hopeful about their prospects in achieving the American dream?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think there is a piece of the sort of the pageant of wealth that does give people something to hope for. And then you have to recognize the illusion in it. Donald Trump is president because of the illusion created by The Apprentice. That's a big piece of it. He was able to generate an idea of a self-made man who had gone from success to success. The facts didn't support that, but that's not what was captured on TV. And I know this from being at a lot of Trump rallies in 2016 and just covering this over the long term. People really bought into the idea that he was an economic success, not something that anybody in New York City believed, by the way. But the downside of this is that we have pretty good data on how people feel and how optimistic they are. And right now, we're at a moment where the United States has never been wealthier. Our median incomes are higher than ever. And yet Americans are as pessimistic today as they were during the financial crisis. Think about that. That's an amazing fact. And that's because half of American adults can't afford a $1,000 emergency expense. There are other factors that go into this. It has to do partly with the overhang from COVID, and there was there's a way in which people, I think, they sort of acculturated to certain spending habits, and then those dissipated. But the dominant fact, the undercurrent, is just that it goes back to one of the first facts we talked about, which is that the median hourly wage has gone up 20% since 1990.
In our current society, does modern democracy somewhat necessitate oligarchy to function effectively and efficiently?
No. I'll tell you why. Here's why I think. I mean, I'm being facetious, but here's why. I think that there's a temptation to imagine that, that for a modern society that you need to have. So what is oligarchy, by the way? Aristotle defined it as a government in the hands of men of property. That's what it meant. Sometimes people imagine it means government by the few, but really almost from the origins, it's been government by the few with money. And it's true that we are in a society in which we want to have people who have an economic stake in the matter having a voice in government. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we have it to the exclusion of everybody else. I would argue, actually, that a modern society, to be functioning and thriving, needs to focus overwhelmingly on making sure that the public will is expressed in the decisions of government. That's the core, that's the heart of the matter. I mean, that's where our small d democratic credibility comes from. And oligarchy actually stands in opposition to that. There's the landmark study on this, and some people will know this, was by two scholars, Marty Gillens and Benjamin Page. And what they did is they looked at what happens when there is an issue before the state, an issue before the government, in which you have a difference of opinion between the mass of the population and a small group of wealthy people. An issue like that, some examples are deficit spending, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. That's a typical example. And they looked back at 40 or 50 years of data, and they found that overwhelmingly, when these two positions were apart, the government would side with the more wealthy position, to the point that, unfortunately, the non-wealthy position won, and this is the term they used. It was a statistically insignificant percentage of the time. It was what they said was close to zero. That was before Citizens United. So we're actually in uncharted territory at this point.
So, slight detour, but we're going to give it a try. Post P. Diddy and Epstein, we have seen a public awakening to the misdeeds of the subjects you mention in your book. How have you seen the culture shift firsthand? By firsthand, I'm assuming this doesn't mean because you were at any of the gatherings hosted by these people, but I'm just adding that
sure.
as my own
Thank
little
you
footnote.
for that. I appreciate that, Emily. Yeah, that would be a level of journalistic commitment beyond anything. What we're sort of talking about is sort of are people getting repulsed by our public, by public figures, like the people that we have celebrated. Yeah, I think we go through these, like if you look at the oscillation, not just on wealth, but on liberalism and conservatism, we have this pendulum effect in society where we go in one direction and then we pull back. I'm not sure if it's Diddy and Epstein that is the thing of it. I think it probably has to do more. There's a vulgar quality about what's happening and how the most powerful people live. as a political reporter, I'll tell you what that tells me. There's a great observation by David Axelrod, the Democratic consultant, who says that in the presidency, people either vote for the replica or the remedy of what came before. And that has certainly been true in the last few years. And the remedy is just the opposite of what came before. And I think we're kind of edging towards a moment when there was a reason why people thought in 2024 that a conceivable Democratic candidate might be Mark Kelly, an astronaut, a war hero, married to the survivor of a gun violence attack, Gabby Giffords, like that, somebody like that. Or there's a lot of discussion, I can tell you right now, in Washington, where I live, about the idea of having somebody like Admiral McRaven come forward and try to fill the role of a new kind of icon in politics. The question is whether our, and this comes down to our industry too, whether we pick somebody like that apart and kind of render them, whether we kind of allow an icon, whether we allow somebody to be to be inspirational. I worry about that. I think that our media business we're driven a bit by an instinct to want to tear down.
And by the media, you don't mean you or I.
Naturally,
Okay.
not us. Not us. Everybody else.
How might foreign leaders adapt their strategies, either by catering to Trump's financial networks or reshaping policy to align with American interests?
Can you say that again? I missed the beginning of that. I was kind of caught
How
up.
might foreign leaders adapt their strategies, either by catering to Trump's financial networks or reshaping policy to align with American interests?
Oh, I mean, this is just the most astonishing. It's happening right now. I mean, I think the best example of this is Vietnam. I mean, can I make a radical claim, which is we've never had a president with a big crypto business. And that as an opportunity, as a cornucopia of corruption, is really beyond anything we've ever remotely considered before. Remember, Ben Franklin got in trouble for taking a snuff box from the French, led to the emoluments clause, or at least tested the emoluments clause in court. Trump, even before they auctioned off access to dinner with him, he had already made he and his partners, he and the family and its partners, had made $300 million just on the fees associated with their coins, and on top of what is estimated to be a stockpile of $4 billion in meme coins. And if I will tell you, I can't name the country, but I spent part of my time at a think tank, and one of the moments we had was when representatives of a country came in to talk about how to deal with this administration on a really sensitive matter of life and death. And they were trying to figure out what they described as the package is that we can give the president. Meaning, and they meant in policy terms like, what would the elements be? But it doesn't take a whole long if you're a diplomat trying to figure out what the package is that you can give the president before somebody decides, why don't we just literally give him a package? Meaning, in a sense, if you're Vietnam, as what happened recently, Vietnam was slapped with large tariffs, and then all of a sudden, lo and behold, they had an inspirational moment, and there was a breakthrough in their policy, in their regulatory system, and they approved a giant Trump resort. And you can't blame Vietnam for that. They looked at our system, they said, I guess this is how they want us to do it. And so, yeah, that I think this mythical next president should probably not have a big crypto business.
Well, on that note, how has the increasingly open intertwining of politics and profit, compared to the more discrete methods used in the past, changed the way power operates in D.C. and beyond? Yeah,
look, there's been money in politics since Ben Franklin's snuff box, but it is of a different scale now. There is just to give you a really literal example of this, I was talking to people recently who work in the lobbying world in Washington, and it is now understood, and you can find the invitation to prove it to yourself if you want to see it, that you can have dinner with the president at Mar-a-Lago for $1 million in a group, and if you want to have dinner one-on-one, it's $5 million, and the money goes to an organization called MAGA Inc., which is a super PAC Yeah, it's right there in the name, MAGA Inc. It's a super PAC that is used for advancing his political priorities. And but as the head of a government affairs department for a big company said to me, the problem is we don't know ultimately where that money is going. This is the question of whether to spend the $5 million. And what if he's in a bad mood? I mean, that's what we're dealing with. And look, I have, you could argue that our campaign finance system has been in steady disrepair for 40 years, but this is of a whole nother level. And it's to the point where even the seasoned practitioners of pay-to-play are pretty bewildered by what's happening. And, can I just give you one other example? The pardons. This is okay, everybody can't bear it. Should we talk about yachts again? Maybe that'll make everybody feel a little better. I do think there is a way that these things are just cumulative, and so we just tune out until I put it in my little book.
Yeah. Related to a question I asked you earlier, which is how did you do your reporting and get access to your subjects? How do you get into Mark Zuckerberg's living room or on the yacht of the many yachts you visited?
I think, it's this very slow process, inevitably, where you are, you have to recognize that a principal, which is sort of either a head of a company or a politician, has an agenda. They have something that they're trying to get out into the world, a message, an idea.
Absolutely.
And you, as the reporter, are there trying to figure out, well, I am not going to be able to get there unless I understand what it is that person's trying to get out into the world and what it is that the public is actually trying to discover about this person, and try to find some way of getting these two agendas, in a way, into a conversation with each other. And that's just the nature of reporting on powerful people. Look, you go slowly in the sense that, I think one of the things, if we're actually talking about the yacht world, one thing is that you discover that people who are buying these things are actually very pleased with them and are actually sometimes have a hard time remembering what the rest of the world sees when they look at them. And so it's not actually, people are quite eager to chat about it. And I think, though, when it comes to talking about somebody like Musk or Zuckerberg to some degree, it's gotten to the point where they have achieved a kind of sovereignty that it often feels like negotiating with the government to get access. And I try to sort of remember, and here the takeaway is, in the end, if you're clear that you're going to write the story whether they participate or not, which is the case, and we do this with presidential candidates and we do this with powerful corporate leaders, that if you're going to do the story anyway, very often they'll say, okay, well, this reporter's talked to 50 people. We either are not going to have our voice in there or we're going to have our voice in there. And so then eventually they say, all right, let's talk.
This is a question from me. I'm curious about your sort of broader objectives as you sort of chronicle the absurdity and impact of it all. One might compare this book to White Lotus, the biting satire. Obviously, it's a super successful show as well, but you don't come away, viewers aren't coming away saying, eat the rich. They're Googling the hotel, they're taking out a line of credit to pay for it. Like, what do you hope readers do next after reading this? I mean, are you advocating for policy changes, or is it more of a better understanding?
This is not a prescriptive piece of work. You don't get to the last chapter having read these kinds of narratives and then say, oh, here's 10 easy steps I can take with my congressman to solve this stuff that bothers me. What I hope, and this is always the purpose of writing in The New Yorker especially, is that I'm trying to capture a moment in America that I think actually represents a larger story. And I'll tell you exactly sort of who inspired me as I think about this kind of work. In the 1960s, John McPhee, the great New Yorker writer, wrote a book about orange juice. It was his idea that actually you could use frozen orange juice as as a metaphor for the United States, because we took the same machines we had developed to process penicillin and blood plasma during the war, and we applied it to this new technology that would allow you to have a glass of orange juice on a January morning in Minnesota in a way that you really couldn't have had quite the same way before. And he captured something about how this was a symbol of both the kind of technological advancement and the commercialization and somewhat the homogenization of America. And he was right. That was the symbol. And I came to believe that these emblems of super wealth at a time when inequality is really beyond what we've had in our history, that we had to put that on paper in very clear terms. But I think if there is one prescriptive takeaway, my hope is that people do come to believe that this is not an inevitability. This is not a natural and inexorable climb. These are choices we've made about taxes and wages. Full stop.
Well, I'm going to sneak in a question from YouTube since we got there. When will it be politically acceptable to discuss the endorsement of raising taxes and specifically progressive taxation? Will it take a huge financial crisis, such as a default on a U.S. government department?
I think that there is, I think that right now that the Republican leadership in Washington is gambling with the public mood, trying to make the case that this is not going to be a cut to Medicaid, that this is not going to be a cut to food stamps, and they're going to try to make that case to people. And there are going to be a lot of Americans, millions of Americans, who are going to say, no, as an actual fact of my life, that's not the case. And they're going to try to muscle their way through it. I'll tell you an amazing fact, which is that Bernie Sanders, who is in every way the advocate for higher taxes on the rich, he can't get to the end of a paragraph without talking about it. Not only are his rallies right now getting these huge crowds, and I've talked to people at those rallies, most of them, in many cases, I can't say overall, but many of the people you talk to, and this is actually, there's data on who's attending, many of them are not diehard Bernie Sanders fans. They are people who are interested in what he's talking about. That does not mean that Americans are suddenly going to wake up tomorrow and say, tax me more. But what it means is that there is a recognition that there is a level of unfairness in our political arrangement that seems to be moving in an untenable direction. An amazing fact is that in 2016 in West Virginia, which is the Trumpiest state in the country, it's a place I've worked, it was my first job out of college, Bernie Sanders won every single county, 56 counties in the state in the Democratic primary. That's an amazing fact. And right now, if you look at net favorability among independents in this country, just this week, Bernie Sanders has a net favorability of like 38 points among independents. There is something about the way he's talking about it. And the reason why this matters, I think, even if you don't agree with his conception of how we should tax wealth in this country, we're heading to a point that Teddy Roosevelt and FDR recognized, which is you can either say, you know what, we're not going to make changes and things are going to continue fine, or you can say we're going to begin to make some changes to prevent the most vulnerable people from feeling so frantic and left behind that they take the country in another direction fundamentally. That's where I think we're heading, where I think there is going to come a point where some people begin to say, and you already have, look, it's been 15 years since Warren Buffett started saying that it is crazy that he has a lower effective tax rate than his secretary. That's true, and everybody knows that that's crazy. But our political system was incapable of taking up that message and doing anything with it. And that's because of the distortions of campaign finance. So there comes a point when I think people begin to say, actually, if we want to save this enterprise, meaning a capitalist small d democracy, then you probably have to figure out a way to make it as sustainable in the 21st century as it was in the 20th century.
So I want to end with you reading a passage from your book and one final question. This paragraph here, back at the yacht, to the end of the page, and then...
Yeah, I suppose.
It's one of my faves.
Let's finish back at the yacht club, shall we? I was on my terrace. This is me, actually, back at the yacht club of Monaco. I was on my terrace, enjoying the latest delivery by the service members, an airy French omelet and a glass of preternaturally fresh orange juice. I thought guiltily of my wife, at home with our kids, who had sent a text overnight alerting me to a maintenance issue that she described as a toilet debacle. Then I was distracted by the sight of a man on a yacht in the marina below. He was staring up at me. I went back to my brunch, but when I looked again, there he was, a middle-aged man on a mid-tier yacht, juiceless on a grayish banquette, staring up at my perfect terrace. A surprising sensation started in my chest and moved outward like a warm glow, the unmistakable pang of superiority.
First of all, I just wanted to give a yes. Yeah, you can clap. Please clap. I wanted to give a shout out to your amazing wife, who's is absolutely lovely. But also to give you, I'm so curious. You know, you talk about your upbringing in Greenwich, Connecticut. How has this reporting changed your own view of or attitude towards wealth?
I think I grew up with a sense of that wealth comes with responsibilities, and that was kind of baked into my interpretation of it, and that you get these tremendous benefits, and it comes with a whole number of obligations. This is an ancient idea. I mean, this is sort of goes back to the Medicis, and we're living at a weird time. I'll leave us with one telling fact, I think, that kind of drives this home, which is that I mentioned earlier that these giga yachts, which really didn't exist, as we talked about, the Victorians didn't have anything like that. Well, today, and by the way, the giga yacht is the most expensive object that humans have ever figured out how to own. It's more expensive than the most valuable work of art, which is the Salvator Mundi by Da Vinci. And the Salvator Mundi today, which was commissioned by the kinds of patrons that the Medicis represented, the Salvator Mundi today is believed to be hanging on the giga yacht owned by MBS, the Saudi crown prince. It's not in a museum available for public viewing. It's on his boat, and we can't even confirm that that's 100% the case because nobody can go on his boat. So this is kind of the place where we end up, where we find ourselves. Is that where we want our patrimony, our cultural heritage, which is, let's be honest, something that belongs to everybody? Mm-hmm. Is that really where it belongs, or should it be hanging on the wall of a museum so that our kids can go and see it?
Evan Osnos, everyone, thank you. There are books outside. Evan will be signing some books. Please go to commonwealthclub.org to find out more about the amazing events here. I'm Emily Chang. Thank you.
Thanks, folks.